What happens when the reality of sin shatters the human heart? This weekend is Passover weekend. This Sunday is Resurrection Sunday or Passover Sunday. Do you know the word Easter really is not in the Greek text? We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But for this session together, I want to talk about what happens when that sin in one's life is finally realized. What does it actually do? Jesus has gone through that Last Supper with his disciples. The Lord's Supper has been instituted, and he's told them to keep that in mind. And every time they partake of that, remember him. They've gone out to the Mount of Olives. Jesus has been praying. In fact, in verse 42, he says, "Father, if it's your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." The statement's made that an angel appears to Jesus from heaven, strengthening him. When he finally gets back to the disciples, they're asleep, verse 45. Verse 46, he says, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation." While he's still speaking, a multitude, along with an individual called Judas, come before Jesus. Judas draws near to kiss Jesus. Jesus says in verse 48, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" You know the rest of the story. I like to focus on what happens between verse 54 and 62. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house, but Peter followed at a distance. And when they'd kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. A certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." After a little while, another saw him and said, "You also are of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." Immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said, "Before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times." Peter went out and wept bitterly. What happens when the reality of sin shatters the heart? Because that's exactly what happens here. And I think we can dissect this into several different points. Number one, down in verse 54, Peter follows at a distance. When difficult things happen, do you find yourself following at a distance or walking alongside the Savior? It's his choice. For Peter, it seems like self-preservation dictates that I'm not going to stand that close to him. I'm not going to walk beside of him. In fact, I'll get back in the crowd. I want to see what's happening, but I don't want anybody to know that I'm associated with Jesus. So do you walk with the Savior, or do you follow at a distance? How significant is Christianity really in your life? It's interesting that in verse 55, they kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, and Peter sat among them. Well, you can take the same kind of setting that we first mentioned about walking alongside or following from a distance. Do you stand with the Savior, or do you sit with the accusers? That becomes more personal. It's not that I'm just kind of hidden in the crowd. I'm sitting with people that want Jesus dead. I'm sitting with individuals that are there really kind of on the side of the high priests and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians. And with those accusing tones and the questioning of these individuals, that denial that happens over and over and over again. Am I walking with the Savior, or am I following at a distance? Am I standing at his side, or am I sitting with his accusers? Then in verse 56 through 60, when you have all of these kind of denials, this man was also with him. No, I wasn't. Surely you're one of them. No, I'm not. Your accent gives you away. Don't know what you're talking about. And we compare what Luke gives us detail-wise of this event in the life of Jesus and compare that with Matthew and Mark and John. Matthew and John actually give us more of the conversation that happens in those accusations against Jesus. Mark does almost a little bit, but it's like Luke is almost exclusively focusing upon what is taking place and the steps through which Peter undergoes this understanding finally that he's not as strong as he thinks he is. He's not as dedicated to the Savior as he tells everybody. Here's one who actually recognizes finally his weakness, but it takes a long time for him to see it. There's a statement that's made in those verses about that denial that seems like it increases in intensity almost every time. So, am I going to be one who speaks with denial? Or am I going to show my dedication to Christ and what I say and what I do? What would have happened if he had engaged in conversation with those sitting around that fire, asking them why they are on the side of those who want Jesus taken out of the way? Have they taken time to listen to what Jesus has said? Can they find fault with any of his teachings? Do they have any answer for the miracles that Jesus has performed in front of countless numbers of witnesses? Those could have been brought up in discussion. They're not, because he wants to be in the shadows. He would rather sit with the accusers than stand with the Savior. He would rather speak words of denial rather than show his dedication. In verse 60, while the second half of it, while Peter is still speaking, the rooster crows. And the Lord turns and looks at Peter. Now, while Luke does not give us where Peter's eyes focus at that moment in time, I think you can almost guarantee that when that rooster crows, Peter looks in the direction of Jesus and sees Jesus looking back at him. So here's a memory of words that the Savior had said versus the moment of the way of sin that he's been caught in repetitively at this particular point in time. Back in chapter 22, Jesus talks about the fact that somebody's going to betray him. Verse 21 and 22. And they begin to question among themselves, who is it? Which one of them would it be who would do such a thing? And then verse 24. Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. Are you kidding? After Jesus talks about the fact that one of these individuals is going to betray him, and they're wondering who, then they start talking about who's going to be the greatest. Down in verse 33, Peter says, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. It's almost a way of verbalizing his thought that, hey, I'm going to be the greatest because, look, I will go with you no matter what happens. And Jesus says, I'll tell you, Peter, verse 34, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny 3 times that you even know me. So when that rooster crows, Jesus turns and looks at Peter. Peter's got to be looking at Jesus. And he remembers what Jesus said. The memory of the words of the Savior at this point overshadows that momentary way of sin that he is encompassed in with everything that he's doing. And he goes out and he weeps bitterly. You know, the situations where we take a view of ourselves and realize, well, I'm not as strong spiritually as I would like to be or thought I was. I'm not as devout, perhaps, as I know I should be. I'm not even as good as I want to be. And then it's almost without question that, well, I'm just no use. I'm just no use to God. I'm just worthless. I don't have His Word in my heart to where it keeps me from floundering in life. I'm just worthless. There's a statement that Jesus made back in that conversation in Luke 22, where He tells Simon Peter, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. But I, Jesus says, have prayed for you, that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. When we can get to that point that we recognize we're not as great as we would like to think we are, we're not as devoted to Christ as we try to put on an appearance of being, we're really not as good as we want to be and want everybody else to think that we are. Instead of reaching that conclusion, well, God can't use me, think about all of the individuals during the life of Jesus and from that point till now, Christian men and women, who had failures, who had faults, who were used in very mighty ways for the cause of Christ. So when you get to thinking, I can't do this, when you get to thinking, I'm not good enough to be a child of God, when you start thinking, I'm not devoted nearly as much as I need to be to the cause of Christ, so certainly God can't use me, the answer is yes, He can. Think about Peter and put yourself in his sandals when he hear that rooster crow and look in the direction of Jesus and you see Jesus turn back around and look at you. What happens when sin shatters the human heart? The human heart can be rebuilt, this time in the image of God, not of us. Stay safe this week. We'll talk again soon.